Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we begin a slow journey through the history of oil, a story buried beneath ancient seas, pressed quietly under stone, and lifted at last into lamps, engines, factories, ships, roads, and nearly every corner of modern life. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm nightly journeys, please follow the show and share it with someone else who might like to fall asleep while learning something new. For most of human history, oil was not a grand industry, not a global market, not a strategic obsession. It was simply there, dark, sticky, and mysterious, sometimes seeping naturally from the earth in small pools or stains, carrying a strange smell, catching the light in thin rainbow films. Long before people drilled for it, they noticed it. In places where the earth had cracked in just the right way, bitumen and crude seeped upward on their own. Ancient people found these seeps in Mesopotamia, Persia, around the Black Sea, and in other scattered corners of the world. They had no geology textbooks, no seismic surveys, no steel pipelines or refining towers, but they had eyes, hands, patience, and curiosity. And that was enough to begin. They touched the substance and learned that it clung. They warmed it and discovered that it softened. They spread it over baskets, walls, boats, and bricks, and found that it could help keep water out. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, bitumen was used as mortar and sealant. It held things together, lined structures, and made reeds and timbers more durable. The first relationship between humanity and petroleum was not about speed or power, but about protection, a quiet bargain between wet earth and human shelter. That is often how great energy stories begin, not with an engine roaring to life, but with some modest practical need. Light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, waterproofing against rain, a little more strength, a little more reach. Oil entered human life not as a revolution, but as a useful black material with curious properties. Because oil was not like wood, which could be chopped, or coal, which could be mined in visible seams. It seemed to come from nowhere and somewhere at once, from deep underground, from hidden layers, from ancient worlds no one could see. For thousands of years, people used it without truly knowing what it was, how old it was, or how much of it slept below their feet. Tonight, as we drift into the oldest chapters of this story, it helps to remember that oil was first encountered as a seep, a stain, a tarry edge along the earth. Only much later would it become kerosene for lamps, gasoline for cars, fuel for warships, feedstock for plastics, and the quiet foundation beneath the modern economy. At the beginning, it was simply the earth breathing through cracks, and human beings paused beside that strange breath of the world and wondered what it might be for. If you had stood beside one of those natural seeps in the ancient world, you might have seen no sign of destiny in it at all. Only a dark gloss on the ground, a sticky edge where the land seemed to ooze, a place where the earth offered up something thick and useful. In Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest cities rose between the Tigris and Euphrates, That usefulness became clear very early. The people of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria lived in a world shaped by rivers, mud brick, reeds, boats, and water. In such a landscape, a substance that could seal and protect was not a curiosity for long. Bitumen, the heavier and more tar-like form associated with petroleum seeps, was used to waterproof baskets and boats. It was spread between bricks as mortar, pressed into walls and foundations, and used to line structures that needed resistance against moisture. Ancient builders were simply making cities stand a little longer against rain, river, and time. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature, carries echoes of this material world. In the wider Mesopotamian tradition, bitumen appears not as something exotic, but as a known substance close at hand, ordinary enough to be useful. Before oil became wealth, it was routine. Far to the west, around the shores of the Dead Sea, dense black bitumen was also collected in antiquity. Ancient writers described lumps of it rising to the surface of the water. Egyptians are believed to have used bituminous materials in embalming and preservation, though these practices drew on several substances over time. Elsewhere, in Persia and regions near the Caucasus, oil seeps and natural gas flames gave rise to stories, shrines, and a certain sacred awe. In some places, the earth did not merely leak fuel, it seemed to burn by itself. So from the beginning, petroleum lived two lives at once. One was practical. It sealed boats, strengthened walls, coated surfaces, and solved immediate problems. The other was imaginative. It smelled unusual, appeared from hidden depths, and sometimes emerged near fire or bubbling ground. This was long before anyone understood organic matter, sedimentary basins, or hydrocarbon chains. The ancient world had no language for petroleum geology. What it had instead was observation. People noticed which ground stained sandals, which shore yielded tar, which springs burned, which materials resisted water better than others. They learned by repetition and then passed the knowledge quietly forward. The history of oil begins this way, not with conquest and not with corporations, but with attention. Someone kneeling beside a river reed boat. Someone sealing a wall before the flood season. Someone gathering dark lumps from a shore. And so oil entered human history in its most modest form. Not yet the master fuel of the industrial age, but a patient helper in the building of the first cities. By now, the dark material at the edge of ancient cities has become familiar, useful, curious, quietly present. But to understand the history of oil more fully, we have to drift much farther back than Babylon, farther back than the first boats or bricks, farther even than human memory, into a world of warm, shallow seas and invisible accumulation. Oil begins, in the broadest sense, with life, not with forests, as many people imagine, but largely with tiny marine organisms, plankton, algae, and other minute forms of life that lived in ancient oceans hundreds of millions of years ago. They floated near the surface, captured sunlight, drifted with currents, lived briefly, and died in numbers so large that over immense spans of time they settled into layers on the seafloor. Usually, when organic matter dies, it decays and disappears. But under certain conditions, especially where bottom waters held little oxygen, more of that material was preserved. Mud and silt covered it. New layers pressed down. Ages passed. Seas advanced and retreated. Buried deeper and deeper, those organic rich sediments changed. Heat rose with depth. Pressure increased. Time, which is the quiet master of geology, continued its work without haste. The soft remains of ancient marine life were gradually transformed into a waxy, intermediate substance called kerosene. With further burial, and within a certain temperature range called the oil window, parts of that kerosene broke down into liquid hydrocarbons, what we would eventually call crude oil. Some of it became natural gas. Some remained trapped in rock. Some migrated. That migration matters, because oil does not usually stay where it was first formed. It tends to move slowly through tiny porous spaces in permeable rock, rising when it can, blocked when it must. If a porous reservoir rock lies beneath a good seal, perhaps shale, salt, or some other impermeable layer, the oil may collect there sometimes for millions of years, waiting in darkness. And sometimes, when the seal is imperfect, a little of it escapes. That is how the ancient seeps appeared. They were not the whole story, only small leaks from vast underground systems. A stain at the surface could be the faint signature of an entire buried arrangement below. Source rock, migration path, reservoir, trap. It sounds technical when named this way, but in truth it is a very patient sequence. Life, death, burial, pressure, warmth, movement, waiting. So when people in the ancient world found bitumen near a riverbank or oil seeping through a crack in stone, they were encountering the end of a process that had begun unimaginably earlier in vanished seas under ancient suns. They could not have known it then. They only saw the dark trace at the surface. But beneath their feet, the planet had been composing petroleum for ages, slowly, silently, and with extraordinary care. For most of human history, the night depended on imperfect fuels. Homes and workshops used tallow candles, which could smoke and smell, or oils pressed from plants and animals, which were often costly and limited. In the 19th century, whale oil became an important lamp fuel in parts of the industrializing world, but it was expensive, and the hunt that supplied it could not expand forever. Before electricity, this mattered more than we now remember. Light was not a background convenience. It shaped how long a shop could stay open, how late a family could read, and how much of winter could still be used after sunset. A cleaner and cheaper illuminant was not a luxury. It was a quiet improvement in everyday life, one that touched households, streets, workshops, and trade. That was the opening through which petroleum entered the modern age. Crude oil itself was awkward in raw form, dark, unstable, and uneven. But refiners learned that it could be heated and separated into more useful products. Among the most important was kerosene, a refined lamp fuel that burned more cleanly than many older alternatives. Once that became clear, oil was no longer just a strange substance from the ground. It was a material that could be processed, standardized, and sold. Then, in 1859, Edwin Drake's well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, helped prove that oil could be deliberately drilled for in commercial quantities. Drake did not discover petroleum. What his well helped show was that production could move beyond scattered natural seeps and become a repeatable business. The rush that followed was quick, muddy, and disorderly. Wells multiplied across western Pennsylvania. Barrels piled up. Prices rose and fell with unnerving speed. Yet even amid that fever, a deeper truth was emerging. Producing crude was only the first step. The greater advantage often belonged to those who could refine it efficiently, transport it reliably, and sell it consistently. And here is one of the quiet ironies of early oil history. Gasoline, which would later define the automobile age, was not yet the prized product. In these early decades, the most valuable stream was often kerosene for lamps. The petroleum business began not with highways, but with brighter evenings and the steady glow of household light. So the modern oil age did not begin with engines roaring. It began with refinement, with stills, tanks, barrels, and the careful separation of crude into useful fractions. Oil was becoming more than a frontier commodity. It was becoming a system. And once a system begins to reward scale, coordination, and control, power gathers quickly. Soon, one company would understand that better than anyone else, and the age of the refinery empire would begin. By the 1870s, the oil business was still young, but its shape was already changing. The wildness of the first drilling rush had revealed something important. Petroleum rewarded not only discovery, but coordination. This was the insight at the heart of Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller and his partners understood that the real strength of the business did not lie in any single well. Wells declined, fields shifted, and speculation could turn quickly into loss. But refineries, storage, transport agreements, and sales networks could be managed with care and woven into something larger than the field itself. Standard Oil did not simply refine crude. It learned to organize the chain around refining. The company pushed for lower costs at every stage. It sought favorable railroad rates, built storage, reduced waste inside the refinery, and made its products more uniform. In a business that had begun in confusion, this level of order was powerful. As Standard grew, it could negotiate more strongly, operate more efficiently, and survive price swings that weakened smaller rivals. Some refiners sold willingly, others resisted and were absorbed later. The process was not gentle, and it was not always admired, but it was effective. The old oil frontier had been crowded with independent operators and sudden fortunes. Now the business was beginning to feel more like a system of pipes, contracts, schedules, and accounts. Pipelines became increasingly important. Railroads had helped connect the early oil fields to markets. But pipelines offered a steadier and often cheaper way to move crude and refined products. Control of movement mattered almost as much as control of refining itself. So, Standard Oil kept extending its reach. It was not only making kerosene, it was shaping the routes through which petroleum flowed, the terms on which it was transported, and the standards by which it was sold. What emerged was not merely a successful company, but an early industrial network, integrated, disciplined, and hard for rivals to match. To many customers, this looked like progress. Standardized kerosene was more dependable than the uneven products of the earliest years. Supply became steadier. Costs could fall. The dangerous improvisation of the frontier gave way, at least in part, to something more predictable. Yet, predictability came with concentration. As the company grew larger, critics worried that too much power was gathering in one set of hands. The very efficiencies that made Standard Oil formidable also made it controversial. It raised a question that industrial society would ask again and again. When does useful scale become excessive control? For the moment, Standard Oil seemed to embody the age itself. It took a messy raw substance from deep underground and turned it into a coordinated commercial system. And in doing so, it prepared oil for its next great expansion, eventually into motion. As the 19th century moved toward its close, petroleum was already changing ordinary life in ways that did not always announce themselves. Some transformations arrive quietly, as longer evenings, smoother machinery, cleaner lamps, and streets that feel a little less ruled by darkness. Kerosene was at the center of that quieter revolution. In homes, shops, stations, and boarding houses, kerosene lamps offered a steadier and often cheaper source of light than many older fuels. Evening became a little more usable. Reading after sunset was easier. A storefront could glow more invitingly through a winter dusk. This was still the age before widespread electrification. For much of the world, the sun remained the great clock of daily life, and every improvement in artificial light carried real significance. Petroleum helped loosen the boundary between day and night, not by banishing darkness completely, but by making it gentler to inhabit. Oil also spread through industry in less visible forms. Refiners did not produce only lamp fuel. They produced lubricants as well, and these became increasingly important in a world of factories, railroads, mills, and mechanical motion. Machines lasted longer and ran more smoothly when friction was managed well. A thin layer of oil could preserve metal, reduce wear, and allow the industrial age to turn with fewer interruptions. So petroleum entered modern life in two ways at once. It gave light to rooms and lubrication to motion. One role was visible and intimate, living in the lamp flame beside the family table. The other was hidden inside bearings, gears, axles, and pistons, where few people would ever see it, but where its usefulness was constantly felt. By this point, oil was no longer merely a frontier commodity pulled from a muddy field and sold into uncertainty. It had become part of a wider industrial fabric. Refineries, storage tanks, transport routes, and standardized products were linking distant regions together. A barrel drawn from the earth in Pennsylvania might end its journey lighting a room far away or helping drive the machinery of a city the driller would never visit. This is what made petroleum so powerful even before the automobile age fully arrived. It was not only energy, it was convenience, reliability, and extension. It lengthened evenings, supported industry, and slipped into the hidden joints of the modern world. At first, a new material feels novel. Then it feels useful. Eventually, it becomes ordinary, woven so deeply into routine that its absence is harder to imagine than its arrival. By the late 19th century, oil had reached that threshold. It had not yet become the unquestioned master fuel of transport, but it was already brightening homes, easing friction, and settling into daily life. Age of petroleum mobility still lay ahead, but world was already learning to live by oil even before it began to drive by it. And then, quietly at first, the lighter fractions of petroleum began to find their destiny. For years, gasoline had existed in the refinery as something secondary, less prized than kerosene. The world still wanted light more urgently than motion, and the early petroleum business was built around lamps. But inventions have a way of reordering value, and by the late 19th century, the internal combustion engine began to do exactly that. At first, these engines were experimental, noisy, and limited, yet they carried a new promise. Unlike heavy steam systems, internal combustion engines could be smaller, more flexible, and more mobile. They could fit into vehicles. They could move with the machine itself. And they could turn refined petroleum into motion with remarkable efficiency for their size. This altered the hierarchy inside the barrel. The portion, once treated as a lesser output of refining, began to grow in importance. Gasoline, volatile and awkward in the kerosene era, was becoming useful in a new age. The rise of the motor car and later trucks, tractors, motorcycles, and aircraft transformed petroleum from an illuminant into a mobility fuel. This was one of the great reversals in energy history. An industry that had first expanded by brightening evenings now found itself powering roads, farms, deliveries, and movement. Oil was no longer only helping people see after dark. It was helping them travel farther, faster, and more independently than before. At first, the automobile was a novelty, a machine for enthusiasts and the wealthy. Roads were poor, breakdowns common, and the infrastructure of fueling barely existed. But as engineering improved and manufacturing advanced, the automobile stopped feeling like a curiosity and started feeling like a system waiting to happen. That shift reached beyond private cars. Farmers could use petroleum-powered machinery to work larger fields. Trucks began to challenge rail for certain kinds of transport. Motorized movement changed the pace of deliveries, the shape of towns, and the expectations people carried about distance. Places that had once felt far apart were drawn a little closer together, and with every engine that caught and ran, gasoline gained standing. Refineries adapted. Demand patterns changed. Kerosene still mattered, but the center of gravity was moving. Light had opened the door for petroleum, yet motion would make it indispensable. For a time, the most valuable product of oil had been the one that helped households endure the night. Now, the future belonged increasingly to the fraction that could ignite in a cylinder and push a piston downward. The same ancient substance that had sealed boats and lit lamps was learning how to move engines. And once oil became the fuel of mobility, its scale had to expand with it. The world was no longer asking only for brighter rooms. It was asking for roads, machines, and speed. If the early oil age had been shaped by refineries and disciplined organization, the next chapter brought back something of the old frontier drama, only on a much larger scale. In January 1901, at Spindletop Hill near Beaumont, Texas, a drilling well blew with astonishing force. Mud, gas, and crude burst upward in a towering gusher, and for a time the flow seemed almost beyond containment. It was one of those moments when geology stops being abstract and becomes spectacle. Spindletop did not invent Texas oil, nor did it create the oil industry from nothing, but it changed the scale of what people believed oil could be. The Pennsylvania fields had already shown that petroleum could be drilled, refined, and sold. Standard Oil had shown that it could be organized. Spindletop suggested something else, that oil could arrive in such abundance that entire assumptions about scarcity, price, and scale had to be reconsidered. The images from the well carried a kind of modern mythology. Here was not the patient seep of antiquity or the careful lamp fuel business of the earlier industry. Here was excess, force, and sudden plenty. Investors rushed in. Land values soared. New companies appeared. The Gulf Coast began to matter in a new way, and Texas started its long ascent toward becoming one of the defining oil regions of the modern world. Abundance changed behavior. When petroleum is scarce, it feels precious. When it arrives in torrents, it begins to feel like the basis of expansion. Lower costs and larger supply encouraged wider use. Refining capacity grew. Infrastructure followed. The industry became bigger, more regional, more national, and eventually more global. Spindletop also mattered because of timing. The age of motor vehicles was beginning. Industry was hungry. Navies were reconsidering fuel. Cities were growing. A world that would soon demand vastly more petroleum was receiving proof that enormous fields might still be waiting underground. The American story of oil changed tone here. It became less about dim refinery yards and more about a larger landscape of derricks, pipelines, boom towns, and capital. Fortunes rose quickly. Towns swelled. Engineers, speculators, laborers, and merchants moved toward the promise. Oil had always carried an element of luck, but now it seemed to carry destiny as well. And yet, even in this age of gushers, the old truth remained. A spectacular well could command attention, but lasting power still depended on what came after the spray. Gathering, storing, refining, shipping, and selling. The oil age was growing louder and larger, but it still belonged to those who could build systems around abundance. Spindletop supplied the vision. The modern petroleum economy would do the rest. As petroleum grew more abundant and more useful, governments and militaries began to see what merchants and refiners already understood. Fuel was not merely a commodity, it was capacity. In the age of coal, power had weight. Coal had fueled steamships, locomotives, factories, and empires, but it demanded space, labor, and constant handling. Ships had to be stocked by hand. Refueling could be slow and exhausting. Smoke was heavy. Range and speed were constrained by the burden of the fuel itself. Oil suggested another way. Liquid fuel could be pumped instead of shoveled. It carried high energy in compact form and allowed engines, especially in ships and later vehicles, to operate with greater flexibility. For navies, this mattered deeply. A fleet that could move faster, refuel more efficiently, and travel farther without the same logistical burden gained strategic reach. So, in the early 20th century, oil began to alter the thinking of states. The British decision to shift much of the Royal Navy from coal toward oil was one of the clearest signals. Coal had tied power to domestic supply in familiar ways. Oil promised performance, but it also introduced a new vulnerability. A nation could become stronger through petroleum and more dependent at the same time. That tension would never quite leave the story. Once armies, navies, trucks, aircraft, and industrial supply chains begin to rely on oil, access to fuel becomes inseparable from national planning. Petroleum is no longer just something bought and sold in peacetime markets. It becomes part of diplomacy, infrastructure, and security. But the direction was clear enough. Mobility was becoming central to modern power, and oil fed mobility better than the older systems in many crucial settings. Ships could move differently. Mechanized transport could expand. Aviation, still young, would depend on liquid fuels from the start. Modern conflict and commerce were both becoming faster and more fuel-hungry. The consequences reached beyond war. States began to care more about ports, pipelines, tanker routes, and foreign fields. Energy was now a matter of planning, not only profit. Decisions about oil touched shipbuilding, finance, imperial policy, and industrial strategy. A substance that had once sealed ancient boats was now helping determine how global power itself might move. There is something almost dreamlike in that arc. From seep to lamp, from lamp to engine, and from engine to empire. The history of oil kept widening. Each stage carried forward what came before, but also enlarged the stakes. By the early 20th century, oil had become more than a useful industrial material and more than the fuel of private mobility. It was becoming a strategic bloodstream of the modern state. And once a resource enters that role, nations begin to look at geology with a different kind of attention. As the oil age widened beyond America, its map became more complicated and more consequential. Petroleum was never only a story of wells and refineries. It was also a story of place, of basins, ports, deserts, railheads, coastlines, and the long routes by which energy travels from where it rests underground to where societies consume it above. Long before the Middle East became the center of popular imagination in oil history, other regions had already revealed the global character of petroleum. Around Baku, on the Caspian Sea, oil had been gathered from natural seeps for centuries, but by the late 19th century, it had become one of the world's great producing regions. Fields there expanded rapidly, industry gathered around them, and Baku offered an early picture of what an oil province could become when geology, capital, labor, and transport aligned. In time, attention moved further south and west. Persia, later Iran, held immense promise beneath its dry landscapes. In 1908, after years of difficult searching, a commercially significant discovery was made at Masjid Suleiman. This was one of the moments that helped redirect the future geography of oil. What had once seemed a scattered set of provincial industries was becoming a network of fields tied to empires, navies, financiers, and distant consumers. Oil was changing the meaning of distance. A field in one country could now matter profoundly to households, factories, and fleets in another. Pipelines, ports, and tanker routes turned buried geology into international dependence. Companies secured concessions. Governments took interest. The boundaries between commerce and strategy became less clear. Iraq, too, would become part of this widening map, as would the Arabian Peninsula in the decades that followed. The modern oil world was no longer centered only on the first American fields or the refineries that processed their crude. It was becoming more planetary, more entangled, and more sensitive to politics. Yet the expansion was not only a story of power, it was also a story of imagination. Across deserts and coastal plains, engineers and prospectors were reading the land with new attention, searching for structures that might hold ancient hydrocarbons in darkness. Geology itself became a kind of quiet frontier, less theatrical than the gushers of popular memory, but just as decisive. By the early 20th century, oil had become a substance that linked places which might otherwise have remained strangers. A basin in Persia, a tanker terminal by the Gulf, a refinery near the Mediterranean, a naval planner in London, a motorist in Europe, all were beginning to live inside the same system. And this, perhaps, is when petroleum became truly global, not merely because it was found in many places, but because the fate of one place could now shape the motion of many others. After the Second World War, oil entered one of its most expansive and intimate phases. It had already powered ships, vehicles, and industry, but in the decades that followed, it began to shape the ordinary texture of life, with a confidence so complete that many people scarcely noticed it. The postwar world was built for movement. Highways lengthened across continents. Suburbs spread outward from city centers. Private cars became less a novelty than an expectation in many countries. Trucks carried goods over rising distances. Commercial aviation expanded, shrinking the apparent size of the world. All of this demanded fuel, and petroleum supplied it with astonishing flexibility. But the post-war petroleum age was not only about engines. Oil also entered homes, farms, and factories in quieter forms. Petrochemicals fed the production of plastics, synthetic fibers, detergents, paints, solvents, and countless industrial materials. Fertilizers derived from fossil fuel systems helped raise agricultural yields. Packaging, insulation, household goods, and consumer products all began to carry traces of petroleum within them. A barrel of oil was no longer merely a source of heat or motion. It was becoming a source of modern material culture itself. This was the age in which convenience deepened. Goods became lighter, cheaper, more portable, and more disposable. Daily life filled with objects whose origins most people did not pause to consider. The cup, the toy, the carpet fiber, the medicine bottle, the road surface, the refrigerator lining. Oil had moved from the lamp and engine into the hidden grammar of the modern home. At the same time, producing regions in the Middle East were becoming central to global supply in ways that would soon reshape the balance of power. Giant fields, low production costs, and growing export systems made the region increasingly important to the wider world. Tankers crossed seas with crude that fed refineries far from the places where it had formed. To many consumers, this abundance felt almost natural. Fuel was available. The car started. Planes departed. Plastic goods multiplied on store shelves. Growth seemed tied to energy, and energy seemed available in rising volumes. Petroleum had become not just a commodity of industry, but a companion to prosperity itself. Yet, hidden inside abundance is a familiar risk. The more seamless a system becomes, the less its users think about its foundations. Oil had woven itself so deeply into post-war life that it began to feel almost invisible, even as dependence on it grew. The world was not only using more petroleum, it was organizing itself around the assumption that petroleum would remain plentiful, affordable, and politically manageable. That assumption would not hold forever. As oil became more central to modern prosperity, the question of who controlled it grew more difficult to ignore. For many years, the great international oil companies held extraordinary influence over production, pricing, and development in producing states. But beneath that arrangement, another reality was gathering strength. The oil lay under national soil. Producing countries increasingly wanted a larger share of revenue, greater authority over development, and more dignity in a system long tilted toward foreign control. Over time, the balance began to shift. Governments renegotiated terms, asserted ownership more forcefully, and sought ways to act together rather than separately. In 1960, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries was formed by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. The name was simple, but the significance was profound. OPEC signaled that major producers would no longer accept the old order as quietly as before. They intended to influence the market, not merely feed it. This was not an overnight transformation. Old structures lingered. Power remained uneven. But the center of gravity was moving. The age in which consuming nations and large companies assumed they could set the terms without serious challenge was beginning to erode. Then came the 1970s, and with them, the moment many ordinary people in consuming countries felt the force of oil dependence directly. Supply disruptions and embargoes, combined with wider geopolitical tensions, helped send prices sharply upward. Fuel shortages appeared, queues formed at filling stations, inflation spread through economies already under strain. What had seemed like a smooth background system suddenly became visible. People who had treated cheap fuel as a normal feature of life now encountered delay, anxiety, and rising cost. The inconvenience was immediate, but the deeper lesson was structural. Modern economies were not merely using petroleum, they were exposed to it. The oil shock was not important only because prices rose. It mattered because it changed consciousness. Governments, businesses, and households alike were reminded that energy systems are fragile precisely when they appear most dependable. Long supply chains, imported fuel, and politically sensitive producing regions could shape daily life far away from the wellhead. For producing states, this was also a moment of assertion. Oil was not simply flowing outward as a raw gift of geology. It had become leverage, revenue, influence, and national strategy. The political history of petroleum was stepping fully into view, and so the world entered a new mood, not the relaxed confidence of post-war abundance, but a more unsettled awareness that the substance powering modern life could also unsettle it with remarkable speed. The years after the first great oil shocks were marked by a quieter but more lasting change in mood. Even where shortages eased and the most dramatic cues disappeared, something had shifted in the imagination of governments and consumers alike. Oil no longer felt simple. It still powered cars, heated buildings, fed industry, and moved goods around the globe. But now it did so under a cloud of unease. The question was no longer merely how much petroleum the world needed. It was how vulnerable societies had become to interruptions in its flow. In many countries, energy policy moved closer to the center of economic planning. Strategic petroleum reserves were built or expanded. Efficiency became a more serious national concern. Smaller cars gained appeal. Building standards, fuel economy rules, and industrial adjustments began to reflect a new understanding that the age of effortless abundance could not be taken for granted. The lesson of the shocks was not that oil had lost its importance. It was that its importance had become impossible to ignore. Inflation offered one of the clearest signals. When energy prices climbed sharply, the effects spread outward through transport, manufacturing, agriculture, and household budgets. Oil was not merely one input among many. It sat near the base of a great many prices, and when it moved, much else trembled with it. At the same time, import dependence became a more public concern. Countries that lacked large domestic production had to think more carefully about supply routes, alliances, shipping choke points, and the political stability of exporting regions. The map of energy grew more vivid in the minds of policymakers. Distant straits, pipelines, and terminals no longer seemed remote. They had become part of domestic economic life. Yet there was also adaptation. Consumers learned to live with greater efficiency. Industries adjusted processes. Some power systems diversified. New exploration expanded in regions outside the traditional core. Offshore drilling advanced. The system did not collapse. It bent, absorbed strain, and kept moving. That, too, is part of oil history. Dependence produces vulnerability, but it also produces ingenuity. When petroleum became more expensive and uncertain, societies responded not by abandoning it, but by learning to manage risk around it more deliberately. Still, the deeper pattern remained. Modern life was extraordinarily capable, but it rested on intricate flows of energy that could never be treated as guaranteed. The smoothness of the post-war decades had concealed this truth. The 1970s and their aftermath revealed it. Oil was not just fuel. It was exposure, planning, and the ongoing discipline of making a fragile system feel stable enough for ordinary life. By the late 20th century, the oil world had become so large and so interconnected that it could no longer be understood only through wells, pipelines, and refineries. Petroleum was still a physical substance lifted from the ground and burned in engines, but it was also increasingly a traded, priced, hedged, and constantly interpreted force within global finance. The physical system kept growing more complex. Offshore drilling moved into deeper and more demanding waters, where steel platforms stood over the sea and engineering stretched farther from shore. Supertankers carried immense volumes across oceans. Ports, terminals, and storage hubs linked distant regions into a circulation system that rarely slept. Oil was geography in motion. At the same time, the market around oil became more abstract. Benchmark crudes emerged as widely watched reference points. Traders, refiners, producers, and consumers looked not only at present supply, but at expectations of future supply. Futures markets expanded, allowing participants to lock in prices or speculate on where they might move. The barrel itself was now joined by the contract, the screen, and the forecast. This changed the experience of oil even for people far removed from the industry. A driver buying fuel did not see the tanker route, the futures position, the refinery maintenance schedule, or the political risk premium folded into the price. Yet all of these might be present in that number, glowing on the pump. Oil had become both tangible and symbolic. It was mud and ocean, rock and flame, but also sentiment, probability, and fear. Weather could move it, war could move it, OPEC decisions could move it. A refinery outage, a shipping disruption, or a shift in expected demand could move it. The petroleum age had entered a phase in which physical infrastructure and financial perception lived side by side. This did not make oil unreal. If anything, it made its reality harder to hold in one picture. A single barrel might belong at once to geology, engineering, diplomacy, accounting, and speculation. To follow oil now was to follow a system of astonishing scale in which ships, traders, states, and consumers were all tied together by price and flow. And still, through all that complexity, the older truth remained. Petroleum mattered because societies had built themselves around what it could do. The market had become faster, more layered and more financialized, but the dependence underneath it was still physical. Planes needed fuel, trucks needed diesel, petrochemical plants needed feedstock. Homes, roads, and goods still carried oil's imprint. The late 20th century oil system was therefore both sophisticated and strangely fragile. It could move immense value across oceans and across screens, but it still depended, as ever, on the steady passage of a dark liquid from beneath the earth into the machinery of modern life. By the closing decades of the 20th century, another strand of the oil story could no longer be kept at the margins. For generations, petroleum had been described mainly through its usefulness. The light it provided, the engines it fed, the industries it enabled, the comforts it made common. But every great system leaves traces beyond its advertised benefits, and oil was no exception. Some of those traces were sudden and visible. There were spills that blackened shorelines, coated birds, and turned calm water into a shining film of damage. There was urban smog, thick with the byproducts of combustion, settling over cities where traffic and industry had grown faster than air could clear. There were leaks, flares, and contaminated ground near places where extraction and refining had brought wealth, labor, and risk together. Other consequences were quieter, slower, and therefore easier to postpone in the public mind. Scientists had long understood that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases could influence the Earth's temperature by trapping heat in the atmosphere. As the 20th century advanced, and as the burning of fossil fuels expanded across power systems, transport networks, and industry, the long-term implications of that warming became harder to ignore. Oil was not the only contributor, but it was one of the great carriers of carbon into modern life. This changed the moral atmosphere around petroleum. A substance that had once stood mainly for progress now carried a double image. It still powered mobility, agriculture, commerce, and daily convenience. Yet it also raised questions about air, climate, coasts, weather, and what kind of inheritance industrial abundance might leave behind. The barrel no longer arrived alone. It arrived with a shadow. Even so, the story was never simple. Many of the societies most concerned about environmental risk were also deeply dependent on the systems oil had made possible. Roads, supply chains, fertilizers, plastics, aviation, emergency services, shipping, and the wider architecture of growth all remained intertwined with petroleum. Wanting cleaner air or a more stable climate did not instantly reveal how to unwind that dependence. So, the late 20th century entered a more reflective phase. Oil was still necessary, still desired, still defended, but it was no longer innocent in the imagination of the modern world. A fuel once praised almost entirely for what it enabled was now judged partly by what it altered. And that change in perception prepared the ground for the next surprise in the history of oil, not its disappearance, but its unexpected renewal in places many thought had already told their full story. The age of easy certainty was ending, and a more unsettled energy conscience was beginning. For a time, Many people assumed the great map of oil had already been drawn. The giant conventional fields were known. Mature provinces had aged. Import dependence appeared, in some countries, to be a durable fact of life. Then, a different combination of geology and engineering began to redraw the picture. The rock in question was shale, along with other dense formations that held oil and natural gas in ways older techniques had struggled to unlock economically. These resources were not always hidden in the sense that no one knew they existed. Often, the hydrocarbons were known to be there. The difficulty was persuading them to flow at meaningful scale. That is where method changed the story. Hydraulic fracturing, which uses fluid under pressure to create tiny fractures in rock, had existed in various forms for decades. Horizontal drilling had also been developing over time, but when these techniques were combined with improved geological understanding, better drilling tools, more precise steering, and a willingness to experiment across broad acreage, something remarkable happened. Rock once treated as stubborn source material began to behave like a major producing resource. The effect was especially dramatic in the United States. Fields and formations that had not fit neatly into the old conventional model began yielding oil and gas in volumes large enough to transform national output. Places like the Bakken, Eagle Ford, and Permian became part of a new chapter in petroleum history, one shaped less by towering gushers than by repetitive technical mastery. Drilling, fracturing, completing, and connecting well after well across wide landscapes. There was a curious modern beauty to it. Not the romance of a single spectacular strike, but the discipline of iteration. Engineers and geologists studied decline curves, rock quality, lateral lengths, completion designs, and the spacing between wells. Data accumulated, techniques improved, costs shifted. What looked uncertain one year could look scalable a few years later. The shale boom reminded the world of something oil history had shown before. Predictions of fixed limits can be overturned by technology, timing, and price. A resource thought too difficult, too expensive, or too dispersed may become central once methods evolve. Petroleum had done this before through refining, pipelines, offshore engineering, and deep-water drilling. Now it was doing it again through the marriage of shale geology and modern drilling. And so, at the very moment when many people were beginning to imagine a future after oil, oil itself found a way to become newly abundant in places that had seemed mature. The story once again refused to end when expected. That surprise would echo far beyond the well pad. As shale production grew, its consequences spread outward through prices, places, and politics. The boom was not only about more barrels and gas, it was about a changing mood, one in which assumptions about scarcity, dependence, and global energy hierarchy had to be reconsidered. In the United States, rising output altered the national energy conversation. A country long accustomed to worrying about external supply gained a new sense of domestic abundance. Imports did not vanish, and the oil system remained global. But the psychological shift was real. Energy security began to sound less like anxiety and more like capability. The phrase shale revolution was used often because, in many ways, it felt deserved. Local landscapes changed as well. Drilling activity brought trucks, labor camps, roads, pipelines, compressor stations, water demand, sand logistics, and sudden economic surges to regions that had once been quieter. Some towns prospered quickly. Hotels filled, wages rose, land values changed, and familiar rural rhythms gave way to an industrial tempo. Yet boom conditions also brought strain. Traffic, housing shortages, noise, and the visible sense that rapid extraction asks a great deal from a place all at once. Markets responded in their own language. More supply helped weaken the idea that oil scarcity would tighten without relief. Prices shifted, export patterns changed. OPEC and other major producers had to respond to a world in which flexible shale output could appear faster than many conventional mega projects. The balance of global petroleum power did not disappear, but it became more dynamic. Still, shale was never magic. Wells often declined quickly compared with older giant conventional fields, which meant producers had to keep drilling to sustain momentum. Capital discipline mattered. Service costs mattered. Prices mattered. The same technological system that unlocked supply also demanded constant effort, reinvestment, and unusually close attention to economics at the well level. This gave shale a different character from the great oil myths of the past. It was less about one spectacular discovery and more about manufacturing-like repetition across geology that was vast but not simple. It rewarded learning curves, logistics, and financial endurance. It was abundance achieved through relentless technique. And yet, for all its complications, the shale boom changed the tone of the energy world. It reminded governments, investors, and consumers that oil history was still being written in real time, and that technology could still surprise the market with new chapters. But surprise is not the same thing as resolution. More supply could delay certain fears, lower some costs, and reorder geopolitics. It could not answer the deeper question gathering at the horizon: how long a modern civilization could remain organized around oil, even if it could still find more of it. By now, the question facing the oil age was no longer whether petroleum had mattered. That was beyond dispute. The harder question was what exactly could replace it, and where replacement would prove easiest or hardest. Some uses of oil, after all, are more stubborn than others. Electric cars can reduce gasoline demand in certain settings. Renewable power can displace fossil generation on electrical grids. Better insulation, efficient machinery, public transit, and smarter urban design can all reduce the amount of fuel societies require. In some parts of this system, alternatives are no longer distant ideals. They are practical and already unfolding. But petroleum does more than propel private cars. It fuels aviation, shipping, heavy transport, and specialized industrial equipment. It provides feedstocks for petrochemicals, plastics, synthetic fibers, detergents, solvents, and countless intermediate materials. Agriculture depends not only on fuel for machinery and transport, but on broader fossil fuel systems tied to fertilizer and industrial chemistry. Even when people imagine replacing oil, they often imagine only the visible part: the car, the pump, the exhaust. The hidden part is larger. Oil is inside road surfaces, packaging, medical equipment, paints, electronics, insulation, cosmetics, clothing, and the long chain of materials that support ordinary life. To reduce dependence on petroleum is therefore not just to swap one engine for another. It is to rethink mobility, manufacturing, chemistry, design, and the scale at which societies consume disposable material. That is why the future after oil is unlikely to arrive as a single dramatic switch. It will come unevenly, sector by sector, region by region. Some transitions may move quickly where electricity works well and policy supports it. Others may advance slowly where alternatives are costly, immature, or physically constrained. Batteries may help in one domain, hydrogen in another. Synthetic fuels may matter in niches. Nuclear, renewables, storage, and more efficient grids may reduce oil's role indirectly by changing the broader energy system around it. There is no single door out, only many paths, some clear, and some still uncertain. Yet the direction of thought has shifted. Where earlier generations mainly asked how to find, lift, refine, and distribute more petroleum, the present age also asks how to use less of it without giving up stability, comfort, or modern capability. This is not a small engineering puzzle. It is a civilizational design question. And so the story of oil now leans toward another kind of creativity. Not only the ingenuity that unlocked shale or built refineries, but the ingenuity required to imagine a prosperous world that gradually needs fewer barrels to function well. Looking back across the long history of oil, what is most striking is its power, but also its patience. For ages, it waded beneath ancient seas, turned to stone. Then it appeared to people first as seep and bitumen, as waterproofing and mortar, as a curious substance near riverbanks and sacred fires. Later, it became lamp fuel, then lubricant, then gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, plastic feedstock, and one of the great enabling materials of modern civilization. Oil has been humble and imperial, domestic and geopolitical, hidden and obvious all at once. It lit evening rooms before electricity was common. It reduced friction inside the machinery of industry. It powered the car, the truck, the ship, the airplane, and much of modern abundance. It also helped shape diplomacy, war, suburban life, convenience, and the habits of motion that now feel ordinary. Its gifts were real, so were its costs. The history of oil is not best told as a simple tale of triumph or villainy. It is closer to a story of usefulness that kept expanding until societies could hardly imagine themselves without it. And by the time that dependence was fully visible, the consequences had widened too. Spills, pollution, strategic vulnerability, climate risk, and the uneasy knowledge that the fuel which made modern life so mobile also left it exposed. Still, history rarely moves by clean reversals. The world will not wake tomorrow free of oil. Planes will still fly. Ships will still cross oceans. Roads, plastics, fertilizers, and supply chains will still carry its imprint. Even the systems built to reduce oil dependence will often rely for a time on processes shaped by fossil energy. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to understand petroleum now, not as a force to be praised without question, nor one to be dismissed without memory, but as one of the great materials through which humanity extended its reach, brilliantly, recklessly, creatively, and at enormous scale. It brightened nights, moved continents, fed industries, and altered daily life. It also asked future generations to solve problems the first generations scarcely knew they were creating. And so, tonight, as this long guide to the history of oil comes to rest, we leave it where all histories finally belong, not only in the past, but in the choices still unfolding ahead. The wells, refineries, tankers, highways, flare stacks, and reservoirs waiting in darkness, they are all part of one long human effort to command energy and live more expansively upon the earth. Now the task is gentler: to remember what oil made possible, to understand what it made costly, and to imagine, slowly and carefully, what kind of world might come after it. The night is deep now, and the world is still. Let the roads grow still. Let the old derricks rest against the horizon of the mind, and let all the restless machinery of history drift a little farther away. Good night.